in and out of the Beltway. From large cities to small towns to the rural heartland. From sea to shining sea. This is Wehman, Brunson, and Vernuccio. Inside the News.
Welcome back to another week of Inside the News. So glad that you are with us, and we've got a lot of stuff to cover this weekend. A lot of stuff, meaning material, news, inside, in-depth material that only our guys have. How you doing, Ben Brunson?
I am doing just great, Guy Wehman. It's a pleasure to be with you and Frank once again.
And Frank Vernuccio, how you doing?
Reporting to you from behind enemy lines in New York City.
Oh, my goodness. And we see that Ben is doing his porch side interview today from Little House on the Prairie. From an undisclosed location is what we have to say. A lot going on. And let's start with the virus here, Frank. And this is our domestic segment. And the virus is really consuming a lot of news right now, as it should, because people are getting sick. Florida has just exploded here. And just within hours of this taping, what has happened is that California just says, we're going back on lockdown. Frank, what do you make of that?
Well, of course, the news media is concentrating heavily on this because, let's be blunt, on the more permanent issues, the economy, foreign affairs, the left really has nothing to say that would do well for them. The virus is a godsend, quite frankly, to the Democratic Party. Is the virus real? It appears to be. Certainly the numbers are all there. Should we be careful? Of course we should. But the reality of it is the news media has concentrated on this to the exclusion of almost all other stories except for Black Lives Matter because it is so good for the Democrats' chances in 2020.
Boy, isn't that the truth? And Ben, what I started out with, and we do pre-production notes days before we get on the air here. But Ben, what I said is that the left, I believe, and I hate to say this, but I believe that they want the virus to win more than the American people. What do you make of that, Ben?
Oh, well, there's no question about it. Unfortunately, that is the pathway to a big victory in November, at least in the eyes of a lot of Democratic operatives. This disastrous shutdown of the economy, the impact on our economy, it's taken away the huge benefit and major advantage that Donald Trump had, which is his stewardship of the economy, which was firing on all cylinders until March when we started the shutdown process. And as I've said on previous shows, if Biden wins and there is a clear Democratic victory in November, let's say they take the Senate, all these stories, these doom and gloom stories about COVID-19 will disappear, and there will be nothing but great stories and a reversion to the science. And the science says that we should be reopening in full force, that this is going to spread as it has been, but we need to protect the vulnerable population. I ran some statistics, as sometimes I do on this show, looking at CDC numbers for the flu in the past 4 seasons. And I'll just look at 2017-18. The CDC looks at the flu season as October to March each year, October to May each year. In the 2017-2018 season, there were 45 million Americans who contracted the flu. 21 million hospital visits or medical visits ensued. 810,000 hospital admissions resulted, and 61,000 people died from the flu in that year. So in any given year, we have huge numbers of infected through the flu, but of course, most flus, there's some level of antibodies that are spread through the population, so it's not as deadly as this current flu has been. It's certainly been deadlier than the flu. On the other hand, the deaths have been almost exclusively among the aged, or overwhelmingly among those over the age of 75. And I suspect that a lot of those deaths probably were other causes, but if you had the antibodies or any proof that you had COVID-19, your death was attributed to COVID-19. So if you're 90 years old and just it was your time to go, but you happen to have COVID-19 in your system, that's chalked up as a COVID-19 death. And so I think the numbers are a little overstated, but nonetheless, it's serious. But we know scientifically that this is an issue for older people, not for the working age population. So we must reopen the economy.
Wow. Frank, let's talk a little bit about the high priest of the new religion, Fauciism, and how that the left has really elevated him up, and how that he swings from hot and cold on some of the facts. And this Redfield guy of CDC, there's just something different about this guy that I just don't trust. I mean, I just don't quite get where he's coming from, because I guess I just don't trust what he tells us, Frank.
Well, again, I go back to Ben's analysis, which I think was spot on. The reality of it is that, but the exaggeration that's gone on and the political opportunism that has taken over in the reporting of statistics on this is simply tremendous. Look, going back a number of years, I sat on Governor Pataki's emergency response team within one of the state agencies in New York, responding to the SARS threat. And a lot of the things that have been put into effect in response to COVID-19 were strongly discussed back when the SARS epidemic was hitting the country. The reality of it is we may have missed a chance to develop herd immunity on all this. When we closed ourselves off to the greatest extent possible, we prolonged this problem indefinitely. And the longer we refuse to open up, the longer this is going to be amongst us. And that's a serious problem.
Yeah, it really is. Now address Fauci.
If you look at the repartee between Fauci and President Trump, both seem to avoid trying to openly criticize each other, even though they disagree sharply at times. Part of the problem when you have scientists, and doctors are in part scientists, is that they will give you all the facts, but not necessarily put them in the context that a layman will understand. And I think that's part of what we're seeing with some of Dr. Fauci's comments.
Okay. Ben, we have talked about Fauci in the past, and what do you make about my comments about Redfield or Redstone or Red, whatever it is? You know who I'm talking about there, Ben.
Well, look, there's a lot of, it's very easy for any scientist who has a sure salary, sure income coming from the U.S. government, doesn't have to worry about shutdown or paying the bills or anything else, to cover their own rear end and just be conservative around this and take the most conservative possible stance. So if it doesn't bother you financially, personally, if you know that you're going to be paid and you can pay the bills and you don't face bankruptcy, and your family doesn't have to cut back and worry about how it's going to cover the rent or the mortgage payment or the auto payment next month, it's real easy to sit there and say, hey, let's shut everything down and let's be conservative. And we know that if everyone stays at home, we can reduce the transmission to effectively zero, which is true. We can do that if everyone stays at home. But the president, fortunately, has the responsibility and the broader vision to understand the broader effects of this. And is the cost worth the benefit? And it is clear from the science that the cost is not worth the benefit, that in fact the cost of our economy being shut down, of sending this country into a new depression, absolutely does not outweigh the benefit of taking this transmission of this down to zero. So we have to suffer through the transmission of this influenza. We have to protect the vulnerable, but we have to reopen the economy, because it is very clear that cost is dramatically in excess of the cost of COVID-19.
Yeah. Okay, Frank, there are a number of churches now that are starting to be burned. And I don't see as much outcry, and Newsmax even reported that. Where's the outcry on these churches being burned? And do you share some of their own concern on that, Frank?
Yeah, I do. But this is not unprecedented. When you saw any of the authoritarian movements take control, there always seems to be reprisals against religion, and that's for a very specific reason. An authoritarian regime cannot tolerate any center of influence other than itself, and religion, of course, is a center of influence. As socialism becomes more prominent in American politics, those potential centers of influence that are opposed to the concept, or that offer something other than a financial description of the human condition, become the enemy. And churches have become the enemy to the socialist movement.
Well, that's a great point, Frank. Spot on there. And Ben, it is quite amazing that the Black Lives Matter, and now we find out that this group organization called Thousand Currents is actually behind it, which is tax deductible. But Black Lives Matter global association or international, whatever they're called, is not tax deductible, but funds are being funneled through this organization, Thousand Currents. What do you make of that, Ben?
Well, that just tells me that smart people are taking advantage of the tax code where they can. The problem is when you dig behind BLM and other of these groups, and we talked about this before, but for most people on the streets, when they go and protest and they express their view that Black Lives Matter, they have good intentions. They're intentions that we can all agree with. They're in racism and police brutality. Everyone agrees with that. The problem with Black Lives Matter as a movement is that it is a Marxist anarchist movement. That is the people who have started and lead Black Lives Matter. They are Marxists at their core. They want a revolution. They want the destruction of our system, the destruction of capitalism. That is what they're after. So there is a pretty clear disconnect between most people on the streets and the leadership of this organization. And groups like Thousand Currents that funnel money through 501c3s or whatever form they have set up, where they take advantage of the tax code and get tax deduction for the donations to these organizations in some cases. They're just people taking advantage. So if you look at a George Soros, a guy like that who has all the money in the world, takes full advantage of every type of way he can to extend his money in these activities.
Okay, Frank, crime. And when Ben mentioned destruction, we are seeing crime at an unprecedented rate. And up there at de Blasio, I don't know if he's clueless or not, or if he's just stupid. What do you think?
Well, greetings from New York City, the crime capital of the world at this point. During the de Blasio administration, crime has soared in New York. We have seen this before as well, which is why de Blasio has no excuse to engage in the policies that he's engaging in. During the Dinkins administration, which was right before Rudy Giuliani took over New York, we saw crime soar due to the same type of policies, letting people out of jail, soft on crime, no enforcement of minor offenses. Crime soared. Giuliani took over and did the exact reverse. Quality of life crimes were prosecuted. The police force was expanded. Things of that sort occurred, and New York City became the safest large city in the world. But I think this is part of a larger perspective. De Blasio, just as Black Lives Matter, is seeking to destroy an existing order. So the bad guys become the good guys, and the good guys become the bad guys. Shop owners, homeowners, somehow or other, they've lost their right of self-defense. They've lost the right to defend their property. And this is all a prelude to pushing in strict socialist Marxist policies. It's all part of a piece.
And you opened the gateway to the economy. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But Ben, in the last minute and a half of this segment here, just your reflection about what's going on and your insight into the crime.
Well, as I've said before, and I'll repeat it, de Blasio is committed to cutting $1 billion out of the NYPD police budget. That's roughly 20% of the budget, a little less than that. If he does that, the police will survive. It'll be painful. And policing could survive. It is less the budget issue and more the attitude of those in power and how they treat police. Far more damaging. And the more direct reason why crime is now skyrocketing. Shootings were up 3 times in New York City in the last week over the prior year period. And that is not an anomaly. That's happening week in and week out now. That the more direct influence has been disbanding the anti-crime unit run by the New York police, which had the primary mission of getting guns off the streets of New York. And they were pretty effective at it. And that disbanding that unit has sent a message to everyone. You can bring your guns out. You can carry them around. You can settle scores, do whatever it is you need to do. I'll tell you the one thing that's not causing any of this, coronavirus. So you have AOC talking about coronavirus and all the unemployed. That has nothing to do with this. What an ignorant statement that is. This is lack of policing and opening the doors, the lack of bail. It is a free-for-all for criminals, and they're reacting quite rationally to that.
Well, you mentioned AOC, and should Biden get elected, she's going to be on his cabinet. Oh, my goodness, heaven forbid. Anyways, though, we're going to be talking about a building in Turkey, and we're going to be talking about world prices on our international segment. This is Inside the News. Wehman, Brunson, and Vernuccio. We're going to take a time out. We'll be back.
You're listening to Wehman, Brunson, and Vernuccio, Inside the News.